Thanks, Alex. As he said, my name is Taissa Danilovich, and I think by now I've met a lot of you, but since I'm new, I've just made a small slide recapping what Alex just said, but also including a photo of Onsala Space Observatory because it was a very nice scenic place to do a PhD. And I mean, I'd never seen tiny icebergs before. So, you know, as an Australian, I thought maybe that would be of interest. It was also very pretty in summer, but, you know, tiny icebergs. Anyway, I work on evolved stars and mainly low and intermediate mass stars. So in this sort of general idea of stellar evolution, we've got the massive stars that become supernovae and the less massive sun-like stars, which turn into red giant branch and AGB stars. And it's mainly the AGB stars that I study. So here is another nice picture of stellar evolution, where we go from the main sequence in the bottom corner there, through the red giant branch to the AGB, not quite to scale, I would say, and planetary nebula, you know, because it looks pretty. But so the AGB phase is what I focus on, and now I'm going to tell you why it's interesting. So AGB stars are key sites of dust production in the galaxy. So kind of depending on who you ask, they're responsible for maybe 50% of the dust that's generated in the galaxy, and also around 80% of enriched gas that's returned while they're ejecting matter during the AGB phase. So they're also sites of nucleosynthesis. So at this stage, there's no core nucleosynthesis happening, but there is nucleosynthesis happening in shells. And they're responsible for all sorts of things, including S-process elements and carbon. So I've mentioned they're losing mass. So they have actually quite high mass loss rates, ranging from 10 to the minus 8 to 10 to the minus 4-ish solar masses per year. And this happens through what we call dust-driven winds. So dust forms relatively close to the star. Radiation pressure from the star pushes the dust outwards, which also collides with some of the gas dragging it along. And because of all of these factors, as I've mentioned, they're key contributors of dust, which also means they're key contributors to the chemical evolution and chemical enrichment of their host galaxies. So, and especially of our galaxies. It's a little bit more debated when we go too far back in time. I mainly study molecules in the circumstellar environments of AGB stars. And here is a schematic. I emphasize not to scale. Please look at the x-axis of the sort of star and circumstellar environment. So we have the actual star where there's nucleosynthesis, the convective stellar envelope, not to be confused with the circumstellar envelope. The dynamical atmosphere and the circumstellar envelope are the two regions I mainly study. The dynamical atmosphere is the site of a lot of molecule formation and what we call parent species. So, well, basically molecules that are fairly simple and form in the atmosphere and then later on go on to form other things, hence the name parent species. And then at the edge of the atmosphere, it's sort of a bit iffy exactly where dust formation happens. And then in the main part of the circumstellar envelope, the dust and gas is accelerated outwards. There are additional chemical reactions, mainly things like photodissociation, which is also mainly driven by interstellar radiation. So this is just radiation from other stars, like just in the galaxy in general. And that's mainly UV radiation that makes a difference here, because AGB stars themselves are not main sources of UV radiation, though some aspects of that are a little bit under debate. So circumstellar envelopes, interchangeably, we sometimes call them stellar winds, but generally we're talking about the same thing here. So they're very rich in molecular diversity. Something like 80, 100 molecules have been discovered by now in circumstellar environments. We generally think of them as expanding outwards in a spherical way. ALMA, which is a fancy big telescope in Chile, which I use a lot of data from, has shown us that basically nothing is spherically symmetric. So concerning, but also interesting. So we do have some that have bipolar outflows, some that have spirals in here, some that have I don't know, it looks like a rose maybe. And part of the challenge that we're facing now is explaining why. One of the answers, or a key answer, seems to be binary companions, and I'll talk more about that later. And I should also mention these plots are all just of CO emission. So this is just one velocity, and these two, the blue color is coming towards us, the red color is going away from us, and the white or green is in the plane of the sky. So I've said this is CO emission, so what is CO? It stands for carbon monoxide. It is carbon and oxygen stuck together. It's a triple bond, it's very strong. Carbon and oxygen are very abundant elements, so CO is quite ubiquitous. It's the second most common molecule in the circumstellar envelopes of AGB stars, the most common being hydrogen, as in H2. Hydrogen is super annoying to observe, so CO is really easy to observe, making it quite useful for studying. So this rotational transitions are easy to observe from the ground, so that's different rotational energy levels and transitions between them. Generally, when I'm talking about transition lines, like for the whole rest of this talk, for all molecules, I'm talking about rotational transition lines, because those are, generally speaking, the ones we observe in the radion submillimeter, which is what I do. CO, partly because it's ubiquitous, partly because of how it interacts with radiation and so forth, is also a good density tracer, which means it can tell us the structure of the circumstellar envelope. So like on that previous slide where there were some interesting shapes. So that is actually telling us about the density structure of the gas around those stars. And it's also useful because we can use CO to determine mass loss rates. Also because it's just everywhere. So how do we calculate mass loss rates? We combine observations of CO with what we call radiative transfer modeling, where we build a model of the circumstellar envelope and then use that to predict the intensities of the CO lines, compare that with the observations, and adjust until we get the right answer. Here is a random example. And so this tells us, well, I said the mass loss rate, also the expansion velocity just comes straight from the observations. Basically, the width of these lines comes from the fact that it's in an expanding envelope, even if there's something a bit more complicated happening. I mean, this width comes from the Doppler effect. The left side is coming towards us, the right side is going away from us. In this case, the stellar velocity is at minus 23 kilometers per second. So that's like 0, it's just not rescaled. Yeah, so judging the, combining the velocity and the mass loss rate tells us about the density as well. So far I've just talked about CO. What about other molecules? Why should we care if CO is so great? Something I'm trying to also convince my colleagues of. Other molecules, we can study dust precursor molecules, so the kind of molecules we think will turn into dust if we study them in the gas phase. We can see sort of where they exist, where they don't exist. So if there's, the molecules that are in the gas phase are obviously not participating in dust like at that moment or in that location or at that percentage or whatever. We can also study isotopologues, so that's molecules where one of the atoms is swapped with the isotope of itself, or more than one, perhaps. So by studying the isotopic ratios, we can find out about the different nucleosynthesis processes. For example, the oxygen isotopic ratios give us an indication of the initial mass of the low mass stars. That's from up to about 4 solar masses, this can tell us. Before it gets a bit complicated because of other nucleosynthesis processes. This is also useful because in the radio regime, the different lines of different isotopologues are generally quite well resolved or quite separated. So there's no kind of contamination to worry about. Or, I mean, if there is, it's coincidental and would only apply to one transition, not all of them. And then some structures in the CSE are more clearly traced by other molecules. So this is because the CO lines that we mostly observe are quite cold, as in the energy levels that are linked by those transitions are quite low, like up to 100, maybe 200 Kelvin. Whereas other molecules, because of their molecular structure and energetic structure, the transitions that we can easily access happen to be of higher energies, and that can tell us like other things, and especially about like the hot inner environment close to the star. Also, for reference, I should say these stars are like 200 to 300 Kelvin, so it's not like they're super hot. I mean, since molecules do form in their atmospheres and not be instantly destroyed. So back to AGB stars a bit more generally. There are 3 types, chemically speaking, of AGB stars. Oxygen-rich AGB stars, S-type, and carbon-rich AGB stars. Sometimes the oxygen-rich ones are also called M stars, for sort of historic reasons or from the stellar spectral classification. So generally speaking, all stars, when they start off on the AGB, should be oxygen-rich, unless something particularly strange has happened to them. Nucleosynthesis, as I mentioned, is ongoing, and we have what are called dredge-up events and thermal pulses, which happen every 10,000, 100,000 years. And they mix stuff like nucleosynthesis products up from inside the star to the surface, which changes the composition of the surface of the star, sorry. And that includes adding more carbon to the surface. So as time progresses, stars up to 4-ish solar masses, but that depends on the metallicity as well, they become more carbon-rich. So at some point, they go into this intermediate phase, the S-type phase. So the idea there is there's roughly equal amounts of carbon and oxygen present. Generally, actually, still slightly less carbon, but it's like in the 90% up to 1-ish. And then eventually, with more dredge up, more thermal pulses, they become carbon-rich. Stars with initial masses above about 4, again, depends on metallicity, don't become carbon-rich or don't stay carbon-rich because they're massive enough for additional nucleosynthesis processes to occur. For example, hot bottom burning, which I won't go into too much detail, but that destroys the carbon, and so they go back to being oxygen-rich. So I mention this because the star I've been studying is an S-type star. So it's called W Aquilae. It is approximately where that red dot is in the constellation of Aquila. It's relatively nearby. It's not the closest S-type star, but I think it's fair to say it's the closest one in the southern hemisphere, so it's been quite well studied. Also means that we can study it with ALMA, which is what I've been doing. It has a moderately high mass loss rate, which actually also helps us study it because there's just like more stuff, so it's easy to see. And it has a known main sequence companion. So this has been known since at least the 60s. And yeah, been extensively studied. So this companion, here are some images. A couple of Hubble images. This recent sphere image is part of the ATOMIUM project, which, well, I'll get to more details about. This is taken in 2019. Got 2004, and unfortunately the 1993 data was before the Hubble first servicing mission, and aside from the pixels being giant, it's just not good enough, so we have to ignore it, unfortunately, which doesn't give us much of a baseline to work with, but at least there are 2 observations separated by almost 15 years. These plots are just taken from other papers, so they're not on the same scale. Let's look at them on the same scale. Okay, can we tell if the star has moved? Not really. Here is a plot that sort of shows it a little bit better. But what this basically tells us is in about 15 years, the second star, relative to the AGB star, the separation hasn't really changed much. It's changed a tiny bit. And it's also relevant that it's changed in that direction, like going away from the AGB star and not like sideways, for example. So, okay, as a starting point, we know there's a companion. We're trying to understand, in general, what's happening with this star. Here are some past results, which has sort of prompted some of this study. And we see asymmetries in the left is lower resolution CO data than what I'll show shortly. The middle is polarized dust. So those 2 are on a similar, not exactly the same scale. And then this is on a much larger scale. So you see there. And this is coal dust that's been observed by the PAX instrument on Herschel Hi-Fi. And especially these 2, we see some asymmetry in the emission to the southwest. So a reminder that on the sky, east is to the left. And this line is like joining the dots from the AGB star to the companion. You can sort of see the asymmetry is on that scale. But the separation between the AGB star and the companion now is like 0.5 arc seconds. And if you look at those axes like that, asymmetry is on a much larger scale. So it's not immediately obvious, like why. So I said I'll be showing higher resolution observations. So this comes from the ATOMIUM Large Programme. This is the central channel of CO emission. That velocity is just, well, it's the closest channel we have to the systemic velocity of the star. And there's like a lot going on there. Also compared with the previous plot, that ALMA observation, we have a lot of resolved out flux because, well, the nature of the ATOMIUM project was wanting to look at small scale structures more than large scale structures. But, so resolved out flux occurs because ALMA is an interferometer. It acts as a spatial filter because we don't have short baselines, or not short enough baselines, I should say. And the result is that smooth large scale flux is resolved out. So there should be some more emission like over here, or this sort of relatively uniform emission is just not seen here. What we see instead is just structures. So small structures, we still recover all of that, and we can still study them. We just can't use this as like an absolute flux scale, because that's what's missing. Luckily, the mass loss rate for this star has already been worked out. So this is just the central channel. Here are all the channels. So each box is one velocity bin that has been observed across like the emission line. I know it's hard to see anything. The point here is not really to understand it just yet, but to show that it exists. So CO is, of course, not the only thing we observe. This is the entire ALMA ATOMIUM observation of W Aquilae. The CO I was showing is actually the combined data. It's this line in the middle here, not quite the middle. And it's combining the 3 different arrays from which we have observations, which improve the resolution and sensitivity of our data. But in this one star, we have more than 110 lines detected, which is a relatively median ballpark for, there were 17 stars in the ATOMIUM survey, so there's a lot to process. Yeah, so we've already found some interesting things. I'm going to talk about some other interesting things, mainly here. So the investigation I'm talking about all started with SiN. So this is silicon nitride. I don't think that's exactly right, but silicon and nitrogen smushed together. This is not a very commonly studied molecule. So when we found it in this star, we thought, oh, well, you know, it's only been seen in one other star before. That was a carbon star. W Aquilae is an S-type star, so it's moving towards being a carbon star. Maybe that's why we see it, right? Like maybe it's just a carbon star thing. And I should also say before I show the next image that generally speaking, for most things, we expect like roundish blobs from our molecules. I mean, even the CO I showed, right? There was a lot of weird structure, but it was overall a roundish blob with some structure. That is not what we see for SiN. So the red star here is the AGB star, and this is just extremely asymmetric. I've shown where the companion is just as an indication, but we get this kind of almost triangle, this blob that's very much just to the northeast, and why? Right, so generally when molecules form, I mean, there are like random asymmetries around AGB stars, you know, maybe like a convective cell on one side and not the other, so you can expect kind of like blobby randomness, for lack of a better word. But this is extremely asymmetric. And I mean, I wanted to understand why. So the first step was trying to understand the actual 3D structure. So this is an integrated intensity map, which means we've taken all the channel maps across the spectral line and added them together. Partly because each individual channel didn't have a very high signal to noise. So this is sort of a quick way of looking at the overall shape. And then on the left there is the spectral line. The orange one is from ALMA, the blue one is from APEX, and the point of that plot is just to show that we don't have resolved out flux for this line. So all the emission that we see in ALMA is all the emission that's there. So we can sort of start studying this by looking at like the blue side and the red side, well, I say separately, but I mean separating them out from the central part to see if something, interesting is happening there. And the answer is kind of is. So the sides coming towards and away from us are just in this central part, whereas this outer part is moving in the plane of the sky, so like moving outwards but sideways in the plane of the sky. A more precise way of measuring this is to look at what we call a position velocity diagram. So here along that dotted line, which I actually derived independently for the PV diagram, it just happens to also join the dots for the stars, which is kind of, well, a nice indication that the companion is somehow related to what's happening here. But going through each velocity bin, this tells us where, relative to the AGB star, most of the flux from SiN is coming from. So the PV diagram, we get this arc. And I should also say this was made by summing the flux like through this kind of wide slit over there. You can make a more narrow one. In a narrow one, we still see an arc. It's just a higher signal-to-noise ratio if we use all the flux. So if you don't believe this is an arc, I fit a parabola to it and then plotted an ellipse with some of the same parameters as the parabola, because it's really hard to fit an ellipse in a sensible way. The parabola was easier, and put the top of the ellipse in the same spot, it kind of shows. So the parabola doesn't fit these edges, the ellipse does, so it's an arc. It's also, I say the narrow slit gives us lower signal to noise, but it is like a bit more arcy. So that's weird, like why do we have an arc? And just to be clear, what this is also saying is that triangle wedge thing of emission is actually an arc seen side on. So the velocity is related to the line of sight. Like, it's not necessarily a one-to-one thing, but it is related. So this is SiN. We see something similar for SiC. There's just the SiC emission is like worse. SiC is also like a sturdier molecule. It is destroyed less, so there's kind of a bit more of it in kind of random places. So why is it only on one side? Why is it an arc? So to understand that, we need to understand a bit more about how these molecules are formed. So at equilibrium, we don't expect to see much SiN. The prediction is for 10 to the minus 10. And at that abundance, I can tell you we would not have seen it at these sensitivities. I mean, at the sensitivities of our observations. SiC is a bit more complicated because we also have SiC dust, which is called carborundum, not to be confused with corundum, which is a completely different type of dust. So SiC dust is what I will call it. It's thought to be common for carbon stars. Where molecular SiC has been observed previously for carbon stars, it's not actually been detected in that many. So it doesn't seem to quite be, well, it's possibly ubiquitous, but not at high abundances, is what I should say. There's also the idea that SiC dust might form from the molecule SiC2 rather than SiC, and they're quite different. I mean, silicon and carbon, but SiC is a triple bond between the Si and the C, and SiC2, it's a triple bond between carbons. So if you break, you have to break 4 bonds in a way to go from SiC2 to SiC, which isn't really what happens. If this is destroyed, you actually just knock the Si off. So yeah, the formation-wise, they're not linked, even though it kind of seems like maybe they should be from just like the atoms. It is possible that molecular SiC might come from SiC dust, might come off of SiC dust as it's destroyed or hit by energetic photons or something like that. But that's probably not the cause, like the whole thing, because that's not where SiN is coming from. So to make either SiN or SiC in the molecular state, the key thing that we need is Si plus, ionized silicon. So the main source of that is photons, as in photodissociation, photoionization. While SiS can be photodissociated without too much effort, it's probably its photodissociation rate isn't actually that well defined, but from what we see. SiS to Si plus S, not so hard. Ionizing the Si is a lot harder though. And that's more something that we need the UV flux for. So we have the Si from UV flux, maybe. We'll get to that in a moment. And SiS and NH3 are parent species, so they're formed in the atmosphere of the star, so it's not, and there's a lot of them around, we don't have to worry about forming those. And yeah, so that's how we get SiN and SiC. So, UV flux. The AGB star, probably not a source of UV flux, and if it was, we should see this stuff like everywhere, because then all AGB stars should be, doing similar things, or at least some subset of them. But they're not. So the nearest source of UV photons is the companion star. And then we come to some chemical models that my colleague Marie van der Sande and Tom Miller performed, coincidentally just before I needed their results, where they ran a series of models with different types of companions. The one I'm focusing on is the 6,000 Kelvin one, which is almost exactly the temperature we want for an F9 star, which is also very convenient. And these plots show the predicted abundances with radius of SiN and SiC based on different conditions. So the dotted grey line is if there's no companion, just how much we expect, which is like less. The dashed line is I say a companion at 5R star. The exact parameters are a bit more complicated, and if you're interested, I suggest you have a look at the paper. And then the solid line is a companion at 2R star, which gives us a lot more SiN, and especially in the inner region, a lot more SiC. The other thing these models predicted, because these studied a lot more molecules than just these two, is that NS should be, the abundance of NS should be greatly enhanced by the presence of a companion. So having seen this, I then went and searched the data and did find some tentative NS. So it's kind of a confirmation that chemical models are right. This does seem to be driven by the companion. The problem we have now, though, is that the emission is northeast and the companion is southwest. So what's happening? Well, what would explain this is an eccentric orbit for the companion, and a highly eccentric orbit, actually. Because it's already quite far away, this works is if it passes very close to the AGB star. So in the dense inner region where there's a lot of gas, it would irradiate a bunch of UV photons. The density is higher. That just means all the chemistry happens faster, like anyway. It's just more things bumping into each other. And then the companion moves on again after periastron. And meanwhile, the stuff that's been created, the SiN, the SiC, bit of NS, just continues expanding with the circumstellar envelope, leaving what we see now, which is an arc of expanded SiN. So this is a line for the companion because we don't know its exact velocity. It's quite hard to measure with the data we have. It's also embedded in this like dusty AGB circumstellar envelope, which is giving it 2 magnitudes of extinction. So it's a little hard to analyze. But if we have this kind of eccentric orbit, then this is expanded outwards. Well, we can also estimate how long ago periastron happened by how far this is expanded. So to kind of illustrate the scenario here, we're observing the system edge on to the orbital plane. So there's the telescope over there. We have the F9 star. This is, of course, in the frame of reference of the AGB star because that's just easier. The F9 star approaches the AGB star. As it goes past, it causes a bunch of UV-driven chemistry. Keeps going. The molecules and whatever that have been created just continue expanding outward with the circumstellar envelope. From our observations, we also don't think it's close enough to like have a common envelope interaction thing with the AGB star, because that seems like something we should sort of see even more. So based on this scenario, various observations, we can go back to this image and plot an orbit that looks something like this. it's actually probably more like very close to 90 degrees, and I've plotted it here at 85 so that it's not just a boring line. Yeah. So, what about other molecules? I feel like I've said a lot, but I've talked about SiN and SiC. But we also have what I would refer to as more commonly seen molecules, as in these are seen in many, if not all, AGB stars. These are older observations that match the lower resolution CO data. I mean, it's part of the same data set. I also say here, ignore these contours. I didn't realize until I was grabbing the screenshot for this that they are meaningless. They're the 1 sigma contours, and we only really care about 3 sigma, which are the next ones along. So if we ignore those contours, these are just like round blobs. We did analyze these when we had that data. We found some abundances, and even from this low resolution data and combined with older observations from single dish telescopes, we were able to determine abundance distributions of the different molecules. And for CS and SIS in particular, we found that this bump was needed to reproduce the observations fully. Whereas the dashed lines there just come from this older paper that was purely single dish observations. So at the time, we thought this bump was part of a spiral arm. You can sort of, if you squint and are imaginative in the old data, you can kind of think maybe there's a bit of some spiral structure going on there. But I will also say this data was some of the earliest ALMA observations. So that famous spiral of our sculptures came first, but this was shortly after, so everyone was a bit spiral mad. And also, I mean, there are spirals like everywhere. It's all spirals or bipolar outflows. But anyway, with ATOMIUM, we now have higher resolution observations of the same molecules, not the same molecular lines, because, well, just coincidentally, this was looking at CO3 to 2, and ATOMIUM was looking at CO2 to 1, as in frequencies near that. But I mean, generally speaking, the different transitions, they're close enough in energy that we don't expect them to like differ wildly. And this data is about 8 times better resolution spatially than this data. And also this is zoomed in more than this. And you can see here that like what was kind of a spherically symmetric blob, if you look at the next contours up here, is actually a bit lopsided. And it's lopsided in the direction that's away from the companion. So what's happening here? Is the formation of this molecule is also somehow driven by the companion, or is something else going on? So something else is going on, because these molecules are mostly parent species. They don't need the UV photons to form. In fact, some would be slightly depleted by the companion going past. But on the other hand, they're formed in large enough abundances that if the periastron was a while ago, and we think it was about 200 years ago, there's been plenty of time for it to compensate and just keep forming, or forming around the other regions. So what's probably happening here is just normal photodissociation from the UV flux from the companion. So especially in this is almost the outer regions of the circumstellar envelope, or sort of mid to outer, the current location of the companion. And so the gas is less dense, which means it's less likely to be shielded by more of itself, and it's just being photodissociated. So these are, again, or in both cases, these are integrated intensity maps. So we see the effect of the companion on a range of different molecules. So there's the molecules that form during the periastron passage, and then there's these molecules which have some extra photodissociation from the current location of the companion. What about CO? So CO is strong enough, like the molecular bonds are strong enough, that it's not going to be photodissociated by the companion, and indeed we don't see that it is. We just see these structures, so let's try and understand those in this context now that we have of the eccentric orbit. So Jolien, who's a PhD student in Belgium, ran these SPH models which now, every time I practice it, but hang on, now they're in sync. So this is for a system similar to the W Aquilae system. The exact parameters end up being not exactly what I plot because there was an iterative process in trying to work all this out, and hydrodynamic models take a lot of computing time. But during the eccentric orbit and during periastron in particular, these, well, edge on, they look round, so kind of circular structures are formed. Face on, which is kind of what a lot of past results just look face on, especially if you have no information about the orientation of the system, you sort of have to guess. But because we have that side on SiN emission, we can say, well, the system is actually pretty close to edge on. And if we look at the like the density structures formed in a hydrodynamic model, we see these circles, and we can also identify similar circles in the CO emission. So zooming in a bit on the just the periastron interaction, yeah, well, you can see the companion getting closer, going around, going past, and you end up with, it's not actually quite perfectly circular, and it ends up not being perfectly centered on the AGB star either, which is actually what we see in the observations as well. So the top right left there is the sort of final SPH model, where we have all these circles. This is a much larger structure than what we observe with ALMA. So down here I've zoomed in on the center, labeled the AGB star and the F9 star, and that's closer to the, closer to the size of the ALMA observations when you put it at the correct distance. And then we also process the phantom model through MC-FOST, Christoph's radial transfer code, which also includes a calculation to calculate the photodissociation from the interstellar radiation field, which destroys sort of the outer circles you can see here. They're on like one side and not the other, because these structures are denser here. And this asymmetry, that matches what we saw in the observations I showed you at the very start. So also, obviously, this has now been rotated to match the sky orientation. Oh, so in fact here, this matches that blob over there. And it's a bit less obvious, but these circles kind of match the black and white circles that I've drawn on the CO. And I know it's a bit hard to see, but trust me, I spent like a really long time staring at these and plotting them in different ways. There is extra stuff going on there, and that's probably due to physics that's not included in Phantom, which assumes well, a constant mass loss rate, which is not necessarily an issue, but the injection speed of the particles in Phantom starts higher than we think it should. So for an AGB star, close to the star, the velocity is quite low, and then it accelerates, and that's just not something that Phantom can do yet. So that's probably a significant thing. And then we've got like convective cells on the surface of the star. Stellar pulsations are also not taken into account, and so on. But another nice result is that if we look at some of the bluer and redder channels from the phantom model processed by MC-FOST, we can see that the like in velocity space, the shape is not symmetric. As in, on one side we have this kind of roundish blob, and on the other side we have a more egg-shaped blob. And that matches the observations, which again, not perfect, but also the lower resolution ones agree with this. But there's a rounder blob there and a more elongated blob, if you remember that the center should be the red cross. So, okay, fine, but so what? Like, that's nice, but who cares? This actually solves another long-standing mystery that has bothered me since near the start of my PhD, which is what this blue blob in the spectral lines is. And it's basically explained by like the companion interaction, and it also tells us which way the star has to be orbiting. Like, at periastron, it's going into the plane of the sky, which is just not something we could determine any other way. So the fact that we do have this asymmetry in the blue and red helps us constrain this. So that's exciting, because otherwise it would just be like, oh, it's eccentric, we don't know, is it coming towards us now, is it going away? But this all seems to point to the fact that, well, it's mostly moving in the plane of the sky, but at periastron it was moving into the plane of the sky. So overall, if you remember, those circles were formed during periastron, which means the spacing between the circles corresponds to the orbital period. So we can measure that from the CO observations. The time since periastron, we can measure from the SiN observations, and also the CO, so the inner black circle, like that density feature corresponds to like the most recent periastron interaction. It also matches that bump I showed you in the older observations, which we attributed to a spiral arm, but it is actually this like denser region that was created during the periastron, and it's like really in the same spot that we thought it was, so that's nice. The inclination of the orbit we determined from the SiN, and we find a set of solutions because the data is not like high enough quality to be absolutely precise. And the model that I've plotted, generally speaking, has these parameters. But the key takeaway is the eccentricity is very high. The periastron is quite small. And, well, the period is long, which we already knew because from the resolved imaging, like the photometric imaging, it's not really moved. So, to summarize, starting with a known long period binary, the goal was to understand some of the molecular emission, and especially the asymmetric SiN emission. So using chemistry and hydrodynamics, this can all be explained by a highly eccentric binary orbit. And I've plotted here the SiN that started it all and the orbit that we get in the end. And yeah, and it also agrees with other observations that we have from our very extensive ALMA observations. So, thank you. Any questions?
I'll start. So we have an eccentricity of 1.9 there. Slightly naive question. How does it get so eccentric? Like, was it always like that, or is it something good?
So it probably formed that way. One of the questions in like barium stars, for example, is why are some of them so eccentric? And this shows that already during the AGB phase they can be very eccentric. There's also eccentric post-AGB stars. So yeah, the answer is not, or rather, some people had speculated that could things become eccentric during the AGB phase. This shows that they don't like need to, and also not during the post-AGB phase. Looking at eccentricity and orbital parameter distributions for like just stars generally, like main sequence stars, the long period of this binary system is pretty average for stars of these masses. So, I mean, that's sort of a nice confirmation. And then if it just formed kind of randomly, the eccentricity is like allowed. It's not strange. I mean, it's unusual, but it's not like implausible.
Actually, I had a connected question, which was whether, perhaps this would be better addressed to Jolene, I don't know, but whether you can measure the torque on the orbit during the pericenter passage and hence derive which way you expect the eccentricity to evolve.
Oh, actually, so this is about the evolution of the orbit.
Yeah.
So most of that model was run for 6,000 years, I think, or 5 and a bit thousand, like something like that, which was 5 orbits-ish. And during that time, the orbital evolution mainly stemmed from the change in mass of the AGB star, which, due to a small bug, that doesn't change our final results, but we realized the AGB star was losing too much mass. There was a factor of 2. And so the orbital separation did grow a little bit. You can see that a bit in the plot. Here it's not too obvious, but the spacing is getting wider in the top left there. so even though the orbital separation was changing, the eccentricity barely changed. So yeah, so the period changed a little bit, which is also why this isn't quite the right size to match our observations, unfortunately. But the principle is there.
Do you have any idea about the mass ratio between the two stars? And like, could the AGB star be moving around within that cloud as well?
Yes, and so the question is about the mass ratio of the two stars. So this is a star where we have determined the mass of the AGB star using oxygen isotopes. And so the initial mass for that is about 1.6. And even though it's a reasonably evolved AGB star because it's an S-type star, it shouldn't have actually lost that much mass by now. So we can just leave that at 1.6. The F9 star, main sequence stars are pretty well defined with their masses. So we know that's, I mean, there's a small range, it's about 1 solar mass. So we do know about the mass ratio. What was the second half of your question, sorry?
The AGB, because it's the larger mass.
The AGB star, yeah. It does move around. And it does move around in the hydrodynamic simulations. It's just in the observations, it's very hard to calibrate to anything else, so we just center them on the AGB star. And then it was much easier to make those plots as well, centered on the AGB star.
Yeah.
So the shells are coming from the encounters, not from the AGB pulses?
Yes, exactly. It's a really interesting point that the referees of this paper, which is under review at Nature Astronomy, all raised, but the way the phantom model is constructed, the mass loss rate is constant, it doesn't change. So these density and lower density structures are just from the companion shaping the wind, or both stars moving around and shaping the wind. There are no pulsations, no thermal pulses in this model.
So in principle, that should be there, and for the two observations, you would want to consider that, to reduce it up. Of course, you would know guess the timing of the pulses relative to the orbit.
I mean, the pulsation period of the AGB star is 490 days versus 1,000 years for the orbit.
Yeah, the pulse is quite long for a long star too.
90 days for, I see. But I meant the AGB pulses themselves.
The thermal pulses.
The thermal pulses, yes.
So we don't think that we see any evidence of a recent thermal pulse here. There has to have been one because it's an S-type star, but not in the last. I mean, the ALMA observations go back, well, like 1,500 years, maybe 2,000 if we're being generous.
You might see a signature in the wind if there was an AGB pulse.
Yeah, we do, in general, for other stars, we do see signatures of thermal pulses in what we call a detached shell, which is actually what this is an example of. This is a detached shell. There's much lower mass loss rate inside it. And that's also very clear in the spectral line profiles of that star, which is why it was targeted by ALMA. Yeah. So it is an interesting result, though, that those density structures, which historically have been thought to be related to changes in mass loss rate, don't need to be. I mean, whether there is a change in mass loss rate is still an open question, but it's not like necessary for those sorts of shells.
Do you get shocks in the shell formation?
Well, basically the star going past the dense inner wind. There we go. The star going past the dense inner wind, like that is kind of a shock that it's creating. So I mentioned the velocities of the wind are slightly off in the phantom model. So in reality, actually, the shock should be stronger. But the velocity of the star going past was, I think in this model, was about 14 or 15 kilometers per second. The wind velocity, maybe slightly higher than that. The wind velocity was, I think, in the inner wind about 13 kilometers per second, where it should be like 3. So the difference is smaller, but it is hypersonic. So yeah, I mean, like that's already a type of shock. We also expect additional shocks from the pulsations of the star, which are not in this model.
And I wondered whether that could drive any interest in chemistry.
Absolutely. Well, I said it was mostly UV driven, but the fact that there's a shock in a denser region also contributes. And some of those molecules that I showed earlier in the, down here, CS and SiS in particular are mostly formed in higher density regions. So they're not seen for the low mass loss rate stars. And whether this is purely because of just sort of like the required density to meet the minimum like abundance needed to to detect them, or whether it's partly shock driven. CS in particular we think is in oxygen-rich stars partly shock driven because the shock destroys CO, which liberates the C. So the general idea is in an oxygen-rich star, almost all the carbon is locked in CO, and the opposite in a carbon-rich star. So getting molecules such as CS and HCN should require some shocks, but HCN is really ubiquitously seen, whereas CS less so. And also, if we are looking at the low mass loss rate stars, CS is more likely to be seen in a Meyer variable than a semi-regular variable. A Meyer variable has larger pulsations, like more higher amplitude pulsations than a semi-regular variable. So that seems to be contributing as well.